Zoe, a bold hotel receptionist, makes a sarcastic comment to a guest she doesn't recognize. Unbeknownst to her, the man she mocks is Mike Tyson, the hotel owner. The night was heavy, as if the air itself had taken a deep breath and was holding it in. The faint hum of the flickering fluorescent lights echoed through the sterile hotel lobby. The smell of stale coffee from the break room mixed with the sharp tang of disinfectant, creating an odd, uncomfortable atmosphere. Zoe, the receptionist, sat behind the counter, exhausted from the monotony of a nearly empty shift. Her fingers drummed restlessly on the desk, the sound of the pen tapping against the wood the only noise in the room. The silence was suffocating, a reminder of how much she hated this dead-end job. Then, the door creaked open, pulling Zoe from her thoughts. A tall, broad-shouldered man entered, his presence filling the room. His steps were slow, deliberate, as he made his way to the counter. He was wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his head, trying to hide his face. His figure was imposing, and for a moment, Zoe felt a flicker of unease, but she quickly dismissed it. After all, she had seen all sorts of strange guests pass through this hotel. She looked up at him, giving a forced smile as she greeted him in her usual bored tone. "Can I help you, sir?" The man's eyes, shadowed by the hood, briefly met hers. His voice, deep and raspy, was almost drowned out by the ringing in her ears. "I need a room for the night," he said simply. Zoe looked him up and down, rolling her eyes as she reached for the computer mouse. She had dealt with so many arrogant, rude guests who tried to play the tough guy act, and this one looked no different. She couldn't help but snicker internally at how over the top he seemed. Who did he think he was? "Sure, one night, right?" she said flatly, not bothering to hide her annoyance. She started typing into the computer, her eyes flicking between the screen and the man in front of her. The tension in the air felt thick, but Zoe had already decided she wasn't going to let it get to her. As she entered his details, she glanced back at him briefly, still dismissing him as just another guy with a chip on his shoulder. He had the build of a fighter, muscular, broad, but it was his face that stood out the most. She couldn't place it at first, but something about his demeanor screamed tough guy. "ID?" Zoe asked without looking up, a tone of indifference lacing her voice. The man hesitated for a moment before pulling out a wallet and handing her a driver's license. She glanced at the name without thinking too much about it. "Mike Tyson," she read aloud, her eyes quickly scanning the card before returning to the screen. For a split second, Zoe paused, her mind catching up with the name. Tyson. Mike Tyson. Wait, wasn't that the famous boxer? But no! This man in front of her couldn't possibly be him. Mike Tyson had been out of the spotlight for years, hadn't he? And he certainly didn't look like the fighter from the posters she had seen. Maybe it was just a coincidence. She wasn't going to get all starstruck over some guy who thought he was somebody just because he had a famous name. Zoe let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Really? Mike Tyson? Are you kidding me?" she muttered under her breath, too distracted by her own thoughts to realize how loudly she had spoken. She caught the man's eyes again. They were intense, colder than she had imagined. There was a flicker of something dangerous, but she was too absorbed in her own sense of superiority to notice. "Yeah, sure," Zoe said with a smirk, not trying to hide her sarcasm. "You're a boxer, right? That's cute. Now, I'll get you a room, champ." She quickly handed him the keycard with an exaggerated flourish, the words leaving her mouth almost automatically. "Room 213. Enjoy your stay, Mr. Tyson." The man didn't respond. He just took the key, his eyes never leaving hers, an unreadable expression etched across his face. His silence only fueled Zoe's growing sense of superiority. He didn't even seem to mind her little joke. He just walked past her, his movements slow and deliberate. Zoe turned her attention back to the computer, feeling a small thrill at how she had gotten one over on him. Mike Tyson, she repeated to herself with a chuckle. As if. But as the man disappeared into the elevator, Zoe couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Maybe she had said too much? But it was just a joke. She had seen this act before, from men who came into the hotel and tried to act tough, only to reveal they were nothing more than fragile egos in need of validation. She shook her head again, pushing the thought aside. She was wrong, of course. Dead wrong. Little did Zoe know, this seemingly harmless encounter was about to turn her world upside down. The man she had just mocked, the man she had so casually brushed aside, was Mike Tyson, the legendary boxer. And he wasn't here for a laugh. Zoe had always lived in the shadows of her own insecurities. She had never felt truly seen by anyone, whether it was her friends, family, or even men she had dated. Her life had been full of failures and humiliations, each one piling on top of the other until she had become a bitter shell of who she once hoped to be. Working the night shift at this low-budget hotel felt like the final insult. She was a woman who had long since given up on feeling valuable, someone who kept her walls high to avoid further rejection. Her sharp wit and sarcasm were the only tools she had to protect herself from the pain she constantly carried. So when a man, any man, dared to cross her path, Zoe's defense mechanism was to mock, ridicule, and belittle. She thought it was a way to hold on to some semblance of control in her world. And when Mike Tyson walked in, an intimidating, silent man who could have been anyone, she saw just another opportunity to tear someone down. Little did she know, she had just mocked one of the most famous figures in sports history. But this wasn't going to be just another punchline. The man she had humiliated wasn't the kind to let it slide. And Zoe was about to learn a lesson in humility the hard way. The next morning arrived with the usual chaos of the hotel lobby. The sunlight barely filtered through the grimy windows, casting weak beams onto the worn carpet. Zoe sat behind the counter, rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue that clung to her from the previous night. She hadn't slept much, restless from her bizarre encounter with the man she'd mocked, though she kept telling herself it was nothing. It was just some guy, just another tough guy with a big name, trying to be something he wasn't. She laughed at herself, the nagging feeling of discomfort pushed to the back of her mind. Her mind wandered to the shift ahead. It was likely to be as slow as the last one, until she noticed the man from last night. Mike Tyson, or whatever his name was standing in front of her. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and intense. Zoe froze. He hadn't said a word yet, but the silence between them felt like a storm waiting to break. His gaze didn't waver. For the first time since the previous night, Zoe's confidence faltered. She had no idea why, but she felt suddenly small in front of him. The smugness she had felt when she mocked him was gone, replaced by something far less comfortable. Her throat tightened, and she struggled to force out a smile, though it felt fake, forced. "Mr. Tyson, good morning," Zoe said, trying to sound professional, though the words stumbled out, lacking the usual bite she had. "How did you sleep?" Mike didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, the silence thick between them, before he finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it. "We need to talk." Zoe's stomach dropped. She swallowed hard, unsure of what was coming. She had expected some kind of confrontation last night, but now, seeing him in the light of day, it felt different. The power he exuded was undeniable. She could see it now, the quiet strength that had been there all along, lurking behind the facade she had mistaken for arrogance. "What's the issue, Mr. Tyson?" Zoe asked, a little too quickly. "Is there something wrong with your room?" Mike took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. He placed his hand flat on the counter, his knuckles slightly white with tension. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Zoe blinked, taken aback by the question. She had been so dismissive last night. Now, she felt the weight of her words hanging in the air like a noose around her neck. No," she stammered. "Should I?" He leaned forward, his eyes hardening, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "You mocked me last night. You didn't even realize who I am." Zoe's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what he was referring to. The moment she had laughed at him, making a joke about Mike Tyson. That name, it all rushed back to her. Her cheeks burned with the memory, but she tried to mask it, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh," Zoe chuckled nervously, her voice unsteady. "I mean, it was just a joke. You know, lighten the mood, right?" Mike's expression didn't change. He didn't laugh. There was no sign of amusement in his eyes. His silence spoke volumes. "I don't take kindly to being made a fool of," he said quietly. "Especially when I'm not the one playing games." Zoe's chest tightened. She could feel her breath quicken, the weight of her arrogance crashing down on her. She had no idea who he was, hadn't even given him the benefit of the doubt. She had thought she was in control. But she wasn't. Her mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. How could she apologize? How could she explain herself after what she'd said? She had humiliated him, reduced him to a punchline, and now she was facing the consequences. "I didn't mean," Zoe began, but her words faltered as she looked at his unwavering face. "No," Mike interrupted, his voice still calm but full of authority. "You didn't mean it. But you did it anyway." Zoe's eyes welled up with unshed tears. The weight of what she had done was overwhelming. She had spent years hiding behind sarcasm, behind sharp words to protect herself from the world. But now, all of that, every shield she had built up, felt like it had crumbled in an instant. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice small, barely audible. "I didn't know. I didn't realize who you were." Mike stood tall, unmoving, still watching her. He seemed to be considering her words carefully, as if weighing her sincerity. But then, with a slow exhale, he finally spoke again. "I don't need your apology," he said. "But I'm going to make sure you never forget what it means to truly respect someone." Zoe's heart pounded in her chest. What was he going to do? What did he mean by that? She had no idea, but whatever it was, she knew it would leave a mark on her, a permanent one. Mike stood there for a few more moments, his gaze intense, before he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. Zoe was left standing behind the counter, her legs weak, her mind reeling from the confrontation. Zoe's world had always been one of self-defense, mocking, belittling, and distancing herself from others so she wouldn't have to face the pain of rejection. Every joke she cracked, every sarcastic remark she made, was a way to shield herself from the fear of being vulnerable. She had built walls around herself, convinced that if she could make people laugh or feel small, they wouldn't have the power to hurt her. But in her arrogance, Zoe had underestimated the man standing before her. She hadn't recognized Mike Tyson, the once feared boxer, a man who had experienced his own pain, rejection, and loss. The confrontation shattered her carefully constructed defense mechanisms. And now, she was left with the weight of her actions, knowing that the consequences were far from over. She couldn't outrun the shame that now hung over her. She couldn't hide from the reality that she had been cruel, dismissive, and reckless with someone who had no reason to be anything but kind to her. And Zoe had to face the truth, she wasn't just dealing with a famous boxer. She was dealing with a man who had known far more than she ever would about humiliation, rejection, and rising above it all. But in his eyes, Zoe was still a lesson to be learned. The day dragged on for Zoe like a never-ending stretch of agony. She had made the mistake of underestimating the gravity of her words the night before, and now, every corner of the hotel seemed to whisper her humiliation. Every guest that checked in, every knock on the counter, felt like an echo of her careless remarks. But nothing compared to the uneasy knot in her stomach when the elevator doors opened again that afternoon. Zoe didn't want to look up. She already knew who it was. She could feel the presence before she even saw the shadow of his figure standing in front of her desk. Mike Tyson was back. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the keyboard, trying to act as if everything was normal. But her mind was racing, every thought clouded by the conversation they'd had earlier. The conversation that had left her with more questions than answers. The conversation that had made her realize the weight of the arrogance she had once worn so proudly. She had humiliated him. She had treated him like a joke. She had mocked one of the greatest fighters of all time, someone whose name was synonymous with strength and power. And for what? Because he didn't fit into the box of what she thought he should be? She had been blind, so completely blind, to the man standing before her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she still didn't know who he really was. Not truly. Not yet. Morning, Mike's deep voice broke through her thoughts, calm as ever, though there was something different about his presence now. It was as if the air around him had changed. He was no longer the stranger who had entered the lobby last night. Now, he was the man who had every right to make her feel small. Zoe's gaze flickered upward. She tried to hide the panic in her eyes, tried to force herself to act like it was just another day, just another guest to deal with. "Oh, good morning. What can I help you with?" Her voice was a little too high-pitched, the nerves creeping in. Mike didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his eyes still locked onto hers. There was a certain weight to his silence that made Zoe squirm under his gaze. She felt like a child again, exposed, vulnerable, and very much in the wrong. "You know," Mike said, his tone measured, "I've been thinking about what happened last night." Zoe's stomach turned. She forced a weak smile. "It was just a joke, Mr. Tyson. I didn't mean any harm." She repeated the same words she had said earlier, but they felt hollow now. "I know you didn't mean it. But it still happened," he said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. "And you don't even know who I am, do you?" Zoe blinked, her heart beginning to race again. She could feel the blush creeping up her neck. "I know. I know your name," she stammered. "You said it was Mike Tyson, right?" Mike didn't respond. He simply stared at her, the silence stretching on, suffocating her in its weight. Zoe swallowed, her throat dry. This was getting worse, much worse, than she had imagined. She could feel the walls of her carefully constructed facade starting to crumble. "Look, I know I said some things I shouldn't have. I was just," she didn't even know what excuse to offer anymore. None of them seemed good enough. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Mike's expression softened for a fraction of a second, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He took a step closer to the counter, and Zoe found herself holding her breath, waiting for whatever he was going to say next. "You still don't know, do you?" Mike's voice dropped lower, a slight chuckle in his tone. "I'm the owner of this hotel, Zoe." Zoe froze. Her mind raced as his words sank in. Owner? No, that couldn't be true. It didn't make sense. Mike Tyson, the former boxer, the man she had mocked and belittled. The man standing before her now, in a hoodie, with the same quiet authority? The owner of the hotel? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her gaze fell to the desk as her mind tried to process the truth. All of the arrogant comments, the jokes, the dismissive attitude, and now the man who she had tried to put in his place was the one who owned the very space she worked in. She could feel the heat rising to her face, her palms beginning to sweat as her world tilted beneath her. You're the owner," she repeated, the words tasting foreign in her mouth. Mike nodded slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Yeah. The owner. The one who signs your paycheck." Zoe's chest tightened as she tried to collect herself. Her voice came out as a mere whisper, "I didn't know. I didn't realize." "That's the problem," Mike said, his voice even, but the undertone was clear. "You didn't realize who you were speaking to. You didn't recognize me, and worse, you thought you could make fun of me without consequence." Zoe opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. She had no defense. No clever comeback. She couldn't hide from the reality anymore. Her actions, her words, had consequences. And the man standing in front of her, the one she had thought was just another guest, was a man who had the power to make her feel the weight of every one of those consequences. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to crawl into a hole and hide. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, mocking others to cover her own pain, never realizing how fragile those walls truly were. She had taken her own bitterness out on someone who had endured far worse. Mike was silent for a moment, watching her, as if waiting for her to process everything. He stepped back slightly, his posture still commanding but less confrontational. "Look, Zoe," he said, his tone softening just a touch. "I'm not here to ruin your life. I'm just here to remind you that respect goes both ways." Zoe nodded slowly, the sting of his words cutting deeper than anything she had ever felt. She didn't know what to say anymore. The magnitude of her mistake was clear, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly small. Zoe's world was built on mockery and sarcasm, a way to protect herself from the reality of her own insecurities. She had lived a life of rejection and self-doubt, hiding behind humor as a defense mechanism. But when Mike Tyson, a man of immense strength and experience, revealed his true identity as the hotel owner, everything Zoe had known came crashing down. Her carelessness, her arrogance, her dismissive attitude, all of it had led her to this moment. The man she had mocked, the man she had ridiculed, was now the very person who had the power to change the course of her life. And she had no idea how to fix the damage she had done. The hours that followed felt like they were dragging on, each minute hanging in the air like an invisible weight. Zoe couldn't shake the feeling of the conversation from earlier. Her mind kept replaying the moment over and over, the moment Mike Tyson had revealed he was the owner of the hotel. The realization hit her hard, harder than anything else in her life had. She had mocked a man who had been through more than she could ever imagine, and she had done it with a careless ease, like it was just a joke. But it wasn't just a joke. And now, she had no idea how to undo the damage. Zoe sat behind the counter, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of her. She wasn't registering the work in front of her, her fingers tapping the keys mechanically, as though her mind was in another place entirely. She had spent so long building her armor, creating a persona for herself that was brash and tough. She had used humor, biting sarcasm, and wit to keep others at arm's length. It had always been her way of shielding herself from the pain of rejection, from the fear that no one would ever care enough to get close. But now, all of that felt so irrelevant. She had built her walls so high, so tight, that she hadn't even seen the cracks forming inside them. And now those cracks were wide open, letting all of her insecurities flood in, rushing through her like a tidal wave. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her friend, Kira, asking how work was going. Zoe stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. How could she tell Kira that she had just humiliated herself in front of a man who was not just some random guest, but the owner of the very hotel she worked for? How could she explain that her entire sense of control had crumbled in the span of a few words? She could feel the heat rising to her face again, the shame pressing down on her chest. The anger she felt toward herself was almost suffocating. How could she have been so blind? Why had she thought that mocking him, belittling him, would make her feel better about herself? As the day wore on, Zoe's mind continued to spiral. She couldn't concentrate. Every time she looked up from the counter, her eyes would land on Mike, who now seemed to be a constant presence in the hotel. She had avoided direct contact with him after their conversation, but she couldn't help but notice how he carried himself. He moved with such quiet confidence, his presence demanding respect without ever having to say a word. It was as if he was a living reminder of how far she had fallen. She had underestimated him. She had made assumptions based on his appearance, thinking he was just another tough guy trying to be someone he wasn't. But now, Zoe realized the depth of her ignorance. She had been blinded by her own arrogance, unable to see past her judgmental facade to recognize that Mike Tyson was far more than what she had thought. Zoe let out a shaky breath and rubbed her temples, trying to push the headache forming behind her eyes away. She knew she needed to apologize, needed to make things right, but how could she do that? How could she face him again after everything she had said? She had heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? Mike Tyson's name was legendary, both in the world of boxing and beyond. She had read about his rise to fame, his struggles, his fall from grace. But none of that had mattered when she had made him the punchline of her joke. None of it had mattered in that moment when she had mocked him without a second thought. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and she sighed, realizing she couldn't keep ignoring the truth. She needed to find him. She needed to make things right, no matter how hard it was going to be. She couldn't keep running from the mess she had made. Zoe stood up from the desk, her legs shaky as she walked toward the back office. She had no plan, no script, no idea how she was going to fix this, but she knew she couldn't let it fester. She had to confront it head-on. As she walked through the hotel's dimly lit halls, her mind kept replaying their conversation. She couldn't help but feel small again, like she had been nothing more than a child caught in a lie. She had acted like she was untouchable, like she was the one in control. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in on her. Zoe stopped in front of the office door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cold sweat on the back of her neck, the tension knotting her stomach. What if he didn't accept her apology? What if he didn't want to hear it? Taking a deep breath, she knocked. Mike's voice came from inside, muffled but clear. "Come in." Zoe opened the door slowly, stepping inside the small office. Mike was sitting at his desk, looking over some papers. His presence filled the room, just as it had filled the hotel lobby. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to pretend he didn't have the power to completely alter the course of her life. "Mr. Tyson?" Zoe said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "I need to talk to you." Mike didn't look up at first. He simply nodded, signaling for her to continue. Zoe swallowed hard, trying to find the words. I just wanted to say how sorry I am for what happened yesterday," she said, her voice quieter now, more sincere than it had been before. "I was rude, I was disrespectful, and I didn't take a moment to think about who you were. I was wrong." Mike finally looked up, his gaze piercing as it met hers. There was no anger in his eyes now, just a calm, almost detached look that made Zoe feel even smaller. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest as if he were waiting for her to say more. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Zoe continued, her voice growing steadier now. "But I just wanted you to know that I recognize the mistake I made. And I can't undo it, but I want to learn from it." Mike didn't say anything at first, just studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "People make mistakes, Zoe. It's how you move forward that matters." Zoe nodded, a sense of relief flooding through her. "Thank you," she whispered, though she knew the weight of his words still hung in the air between them. Zoe had spent her entire life hiding behind her jokes and sarcasm, but facing Mike Tyson had forced her to confront her deepest insecurities. She had mocked him, thinking she could control the situation, but now, she was forced to reckon with the reality of who he was and the power he held. Her attempt at an apology was a small step toward redemption, but Zoe understood that it would take more than words to truly make things right. The walls she had built around herself were finally crumbling, but the question remained, could she rebuild herself into someone better? The days following her apology felt like a slow burn. Zoe went through the motions of work, her mind constantly buzzing with the weight of what she had done, but there was something different now. A sense of humility had crept in, and though it was uncomfortable, it was exactly what she needed. She no longer felt invincible, no longer felt as though she could mock or belittle those around her without consequence. In the quiet moments of the day, when the hotel lobby was relatively empty and the hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, Zoe allowed herself to sit with her feelings. She wasn't used to being this self-aware, this vulnerable. It was a strange feeling, this quiet reflection. She wasn't sure she liked it. For so long, she had built her walls so high, pushing everyone away with her sharp tongue, her biting humor. But now, she was forced to face herself, her mistakes, and the harsh reality of who she had been. The person she had mocked so easily had been a mirror of everything she feared about herself, broken, vulnerable, scarred by the past. And she had looked at him and thought he was nothing more than a punchline. That realization gnawed at her every day. Zoe walked around the hotel with a heavy heart. She tried to focus on her work, but every time her eyes landed on Mike Tyson, now a regular fixture at the hotel, she was reminded of how deeply she had wronged him. There were moments when she wished she could go back, undo the past, but she knew that was impossible. What she could do now was change, learn from her mistakes, and become someone better. Someone worthy of the respect she had taken for granted. One afternoon, as Zoe was wiping down the reception desk, the sound of footsteps approaching caught her attention. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Mike walking toward her. He had been quiet the last few days, but she knew he was watching. Watching her, as though waiting for something, waiting to see if she would grow from the mistake she had made. Mike stopped in front of the desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes intense. "You've been working hard, Zoe," he said, his voice low but steady. "I can see you're trying." Zoe swallowed, unsure of what he meant, but the words sent a wave of unease through her. Yeah. I'm trying to be." Mike nodded slowly. "That's all we can do, right?" The events of the past few weeks had been a blur, a mix of emotional highs and deep lows. Zoe had tried to move forward, tried to reconcile with herself and others, but the weight of her initial behavior toward Mike still haunted her. It wasn't just that she had mocked him, it was the realization that she had mocked him, the owner of the hotel, without a second thought. A man who could have destroyed her career with a single word. And yet, Mike hadn't done that. In fact, he had done the opposite. He had shown patience. Understanding. He had given her the space to grow, to make things right. But Zoe wasn't sure she had done enough to earn his forgiveness, much less his trust. She had already apologized to him in the past, but it felt like there was still something unfinished between them. A conversation that needed to happen, a final reckoning that needed to be faced. Her heart skipped a beat as the door to the lobby opened. Mike walked in, his usual confident stride filling the room with a presence that always made Zoe's pulse quicken. This time, though, she wasn't immediately filled with dread. No, this time, she was ready. Ready to face the consequences of her actions and, perhaps, ready to forgive herself. Mike didn't say anything at first. He simply walked over to the desk and leaned against it casually, as if nothing had changed. But Zoe could feel the weight of his gaze, as though he were silently judging her. She wasn't sure whether it was judgment she feared or just the knowledge that she was still grappling with her guilt. Either way, his presence made her uneasy. "Mike," Zoe said, her voice more steady than she expected. "Can we talk?" He raised an eyebrow, but then nodded, signaling for her to continue. "I know I've apologized before," Zoe began, trying to meet his eyes, though it was difficult. "But I feel like I still haven't fully expressed how sorry I am. I didn't just make a mistake when I mocked you, I made a huge mistake in how I treated you. How I treated the whole situation. And I know I can't change the past, but I'm trying to be better." Mike remained silent, his expression unreadable. Zoe could feel the weight of his silence pressing on her, but she had to keep going. She needed him to know she wasn't just apologizing because it was the right thing to do. She was apologizing because she had truly seen the error of her ways. "You didn't deserve that. You didn't deserve my mockery, my jokes, or the way I dismissed you," Zoe continued, her voice wavering just slightly. "I know that now. And I don't expect you to just forgive me, but I hope that over time, you can see that I am genuinely trying to be someone who deserves your respect. Someone who can own up to their mistakes and be better for it." A long moment passed before Mike finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Zoe couldn't quite place. "I can see that you're trying," he said, his words cutting through the tension. "But here's the thing, Zoe. Apologies are just words. Words are easy. It's what you do after you apologize that counts. People don't change because they say they're sorry. They change because they prove they've learned." Zoe's heart sank a little, but she nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It wasn't enough to simply say the right things. She had to show through her actions that she was different. And that scared her. "I know," Zoe said softly. "And I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying." Mike looked at her for a moment longer, as if weighing her words. Finally, he sighed and pushed himself off the desk, standing up straight. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that Zoe had come to respect, no, to admire, over the course of these past weeks. He didn't need to be loud or brash. His strength came from his ability to remain calm, to let things play out on their own. "You're right," Mike said, his tone softer now. "You're trying. That's what matters. I'm not here to hold a grudge, Zoe. You're not the first person to mess up in my presence, and you won't be the last. People make mistakes. That's part of life." Zoe looked at him, feeling both relief and guilt mixed together inside of her. She had expected him to be angry, to lash out, but instead, he was offering her something much more difficult, understanding. Forgiveness wasn't about him giving her another chance, it was about her giving herself the opportunity to prove she had learned. "But here's the thing," Mike continued, "you can't run from your past. You can't avoid the consequences forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to face the fact that the things you say and do affect people. It doesn't matter who they are. I don't want to see you repeating the same mistakes, Zoe. And I don't want to see you punishing yourself over them either." His words hit her harder than she expected. The guilt she had been carrying, thinking she didn't deserve forgiveness, that she didn't deserve a second chance, was something she had placed on herself. Mike was right. She couldn't keep punishing herself for something that had already been acknowledged and apologized for. "I won't," Zoe said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll do better. I'll prove it." Mike nodded, and for the first time in weeks, Zoe felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She was no longer holding onto her guilt or shame. She wasn't perfect, and she knew she never would be. But she had the power to shape who she became, to continue evolving, and to prove through her actions that she was worthy of the second chance she had been given. "Good," Mike said, giving her a final, approving look. "Now, let's get back to work." Zoe watched as he walked away, a sense of calm washing over her. The tension that had been building inside her for so long had finally dissipated. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Ready to be better, not just for Mike, not just for anyone else, but for herself. And as she turned back to her desk, she realized something important. The biggest lesson wasn't about forgiving others, it was about forgiving herself. Only then could she truly move forward.